Hello and welcome to the Batchelor Society talk for Tuesday the 19th of May, obviously given to you today by me, Mr. Weston, on the topic of regicide, a merry topic. Regicide refers to the crime of killing the monarch, king killing or queen killing. So get yourselves comfy as we explore this fascinating phase of human history, if you like. So I think most people listening to this will know that I keep bees, and most people who know that I keep bees have probably heard me talking quite voluminously at various points about bees with several self-proclaimed fascinating facts. And one of the ones which I keep trotting out quite a lot in politics lessons is every political ideology likes bees. And then I go on to explain why. So, you know, if you've heard this before, you can zone out for a bit, but socialists like bees because every bee works for the common good. Anarchists like bees because every individual bee is never compelled against their will to perform a particular task. Conservatives like bees because the society is structured hierarchically. Feminists like bees because without female bees, the society of bees would collapse. Liberals like bees because of the basic social contract that they all appear to have opted into, and so on. As this is a talk about regicide, however, and not bees, I'm going to just stop on the examples there. Bees are simply the hook, really. The only group I can think of who possibly don't like bees very much might be Republicans. I don't mean the American political party Republicans. I mean those people who hold that a monarchical society is not the ideal form of government. But perhaps by the end of listening to this, some Republicans will actually decide that they do like bees, or at least bees that are kept by beekeepers, because every beekeeper has to engage from time to time in a little bit of regicide. You open up the beehive, you find where the queen bee has laid eggs which are going to turn into new queens, and there's no way of sugarcoating this, you kill them. You should do that quite regularly, like sort of open up the hive every 2 to 3 weeks. The only time you shouldn't do it is if you think your queen bee is coming towards the end of her life, in which case keep one queen cell containing one queen egg alive and kill all the rest. If you don't, you'll get swarms of bees, and that's probably not what you're after. So pretty clearly, regicide is the practice of killing the monarch, even if the monarch happens to be a bee. And today's talk is aimed at exploring this phenomenon and investigating prevalent features of regicides through the examination of a handful of cases. Now, there's nothing new about the concept of killing a royal figure, even in historical terms, where 200 years is sort of the blink of an eye kind of thing. It's an old idea. The foundation of the Roman Republic, for instance, hinges on the death of one of the old Roman kings. So I'm going to narrow it down a bit. Now, historically, if you talk about the regicides, meaning a group of people, that's a term that was first applied and indeed continues to be applied to the individuals who signed the death warrant of Charles I of England after the Civil War. So what I'm going to do with this talk is I'm going to use Charles I's death in 1649 as the starting point for regicide, and I'm also going to arbitrarily only look at European regicides, because it's possible to draw some kind of comparison between European states, whereas if you look at Asian states or African states or South American states, they're governed in such different ways that it's very difficult to sort of draw a full comparison. So I think if you found someone who knew a little bit about the deaths of some of the monarchs who are demonstrated on the slide here, and you said, top right is Charles I's head, why was Charles I executed? Bottom left is a picture of a drunken Louis XVI, why was he guillotined? Or on the right there, why was Tsar Nicholas II shot? The answer you'd probably get was, well, they were changing the system of government in that country. So you got rid of the old system by literally killing it. And I think that's quite a valid first impression, but actually regicide is not usually carried out for that reason. Nicholas II was executed, and Russia was a communist state after his execution. But you've also got to remember that actually it was a communist state prior to his death as well. And indeed, it wasn't even the communists who removed the Tsar. It was the communists who shot the Tsar, but it was not the communists who removed the Tsar. The provisional government took power in March 1917, and that removed Nicholas from the throne, at which point he wasn't the Tsar anymore. He became simply Nicholas Romanov. And he was executed along with his family over a year later in July 1918. And it might sound like I'm being a bit pedantic there, but actually the case is similar in the other examples. The man who was executed in January 1793 was technically not Louis XVI, but simply citizen Louis Capet. He'd been stripped of his royal title by the National Assembly in September 1792. So what actually is the case is it's not that you're changing a regime by killing the monarch. You've actually probably removed the monarch beforehand and then you kill him later as a sort of afterthought. I can actually only find two examples in the self-restricted area of 1649 plus Europe that I've looked at where kings are killed and that ends their reigns. One of them is Charles I's death. So Charles I was executed January 1649, and Parliament had not deprived him of his title before that. They'd accused him of being a bad king and abusing the office of king, but they had not removed him as king. And so technically his death is also the point at which his reign ends, which is not something you can say for Louis Capet or Nicholas Romanov. I think I might have called him Alexander earlier, but I'm not re-editing this whole thing. One take Western. Yes, I don't do two takes, even if the first take's actually wrong. But maybe I said Nicholas. Maybe that was right. The other example I found of someone whose reign sort of ends at their death is debatable. It's a guy called Joshi Murat, who was the king of Naples. He'd been installed by Napoleon, and when Napoleon returned from Waterloo, Murat sided with him as the most likely way of him retaining control over Naples. He was executed in 1815, 5 days after a treaty which had not been signed by him, although it had been ratified by one of his representatives, had dethroned him and replaced him with Ferdinand IV as King of Naples. So, I mean, it's debatable whether at his death Murat even knew he wasn't King of Naples anymore. It's entirely possible he thought he was being executed as king. He may well not have heard of the treaty which deposed him. Therefore, not only was he technically not a king anyway when executed, like Louis and Nicholas, but the regime that replaced him was actually fundamentally the same. It's an autocratic monarchy, but with a different person on the throne. So therefore, we find that in most cases, regicide doesn't actually accompany regime change. It simply rules out the possibility of returning to a previous way of governing, a previous regime. For obvious reasons, you can't govern Russia through the Tsars if you've killed the Tsar and no one else is able to claim that title. Now, this brings us on to the more common reason for regicide, which is not to change the regime, but to change the direction or priority that a government is taking without actually changing the way in which that government operates. Political assassination as a tool of change has got a really checkered rate of success. If I'm to summarize political assassinations, what usually happens is that one individual assassinates another individual who's got political power because that's a protest that the person being assassinated has got too much power. And what then happens, again, I'm summarizing here, is the states generally tend to kick back, grant itself even more power to deal with these dangerous radicals and lunatics. And the majority of the population of that state go, yeah, the state needs these rights, needs these powers, because look, we're full of madmen who shoot people. Regicide, though, is subtly different from that, in that the underlying point of this individual has too much power is evidently not going to be solved by regicide. So I suppose you could solve the issue of monarchs having too much power by shooting an only child monarch who is themselves childless and all their family are dead. But that's a very extreme example. When political terrorists, they're usually anarchists, have assassinated monarchs in the past, it's actually tended to achieve very little in terms of a redistribution of power. So the assassination of King Umberto I of Italy in 1900, or the Empress Sisi in 1898, she was the Empress of Austro-Hungary, both achieved essentially nothing in terms of redistribution of political power. So the reason this is the way this is that when, for instance, Umberto I was shot, power simply passed immediately to the next in line to the throne, Victor Emmanuel III. The office of King of Italy remained, and the potential for it to exercise arbitrary power therefore also remained. So the anarchists who feared and loathed arbitrary power had achieved nothing. They'd just simply replaced one king with another king. Sisi's assassination was even more meaningless because she was the Empress of Austro-Hungary, but there was an Emperor of Austro-Hungary at the same time. Her husband, Franz Joseph, was Emperor of Austro-Hungary, and all that happened there is that the powers that she had reverted to him, and he continued to practice them until his death in 1916. And he'd already been practicing them for the previous 50 years. He'd become Emperor of Austro-Hungary in 1848. So nothing at all really changed there. In fact, on at least one occasion, the regicide carried out has actually swung a regime from being cautiously open to being horribly oppressive. I'm thinking here of the assassination of Alexander II of Russia, which closed down any chance of peaceful development in Russia of constitutional government. Alexander II had commissioned a report into how to restructure Russian society, not Russian society, sorry, Russian government. It was carried out by one of his advisors called Loris Melikov, and it was known therefore as the Loris Melikov proposal. And what it suggested was, this is in 1881, that some of the Russian common people be brought into government in a strictly advisory capacity to maybe attempt to ensure that the autocracy was able to listen a little bit to the voices of the individuals whose decisions it claimed to be making on behalf of. Now, Loris Melikov presented these ideas to Alexander II. He listened to them. He agreed to them, or at least seemed to agree with them. He certainly promised that they would be discussed at a full council meeting in 4 days' time. And then he left to go to church. And a couple of hours later, on the way to church, he was assassinated. And the incoming regime of Alexander III utterly abandoned the Loris Melikov proposals. They just completely buried, and therefore ensured that regime change in Russia would be, firstly, very distant, but secondly, when it came, very bloody. So in essence, political assassination with regicide as its chosen flavour really doesn't work. But the curiosity is that regicide is actually a much more successful strategy when it's employed by those on the right of the political spectrum. All of the assassinations I mentioned previously were carried out by anarchists or Republicans. But actually, the right-wing palace coup has a way more successful track record than any other approach. You go to Russia for this again. There's Peter III of Russia and Paul of Russia. Peter III was the husband, and Paul was the son of Catherine the Great, whose reign is between theirs. Peter came to the throne and was assassinated after 6 months. If you look up sort of official Russian histories on why he was assassinated, they claim that it's because he had an inability to rule. He couldn't do it, and they point to real clear evidence of his inability to rule being the fact that apparently he spoke with a German accent and had smallpox scars. That aside, however, in the 6 months of his apparently terrible rule, he managed to pass some pretty dramatic reforms, including but not limited to allowing travel outside of Russia, which was a first, announcing full religious tolerance. First European country to announce religious tolerance was Russia in 1762, and the abolition of the state's secret police force. And then he was removed. Catherine the Great took over, and she removed the religious tolerance edict. She reimposed the travel ban, and she reinstituted the secret police. On her death, Paul became the Tsar, and he followed a very, very similar path. He renounced some of Catherine's more oppressive measures. He tried to improve conditions for the serfs. He tried to promote greater toleration, but a group of noblemen decided that he was being far too liberal and removed him to have him replaced by his son, Alexander I. Now, this strategy of palace coups I've heavily illustrated using Russia, but it's not just confined to Russia. Gustav III of Sweden was assassinated in 1792, having had a quite eventful 21-year reign as king, in which he also introduced religious tolerance, and he became the first government, I suppose, because it's a government of one man, to introduce free trade into Sweden, which apparently greatly benefited the population. Even a more modern regicidal act, which is, for instance, the assassination of Alexander of Serbia in 1903, can be put down to his insistence on changing the regime. He insisted on having a two-tiered parliament, which would have reduced the power of the army and the court, with the consequence that he was assassinated. As for real modern regicide, I will continue to kill off any surplus queens that I spot in my hive, but this isn't due to regime change from an anarchist perspective. This is down to keeping things how they are. This is the equivalent, essentially, of a palace coup. This is a very right-wing attempt to control my bees. It's also practical colony management, so that's good news. Now, the fashion for regicide, if I can use that phrase, globally has declined, which probably isn't surprising, given that there's been a decline in absolute power as exercised by monarchs, and there's been a growth in representative government. Aside from religious fundamentalism in all of its forms, so I'm talking here about prophets and popes, which still calls on an unquestioning adherence at all points to one individual who is deemed to be absolutely knowledgeable, every existing mainstream ideology is completely compatible with the concept of an at least constitutional monarchy. Even those governments today, or those states today, which don't actually have a monarchy, would in fairness be able to operate with one if it weren't for simply cosmetic objections about it. There's no reason, for instance, why America couldn't have a constitutional monarchy, as long as the constitution that restrained it operated in a way which similarly restrains, for instance, the monarchs in Scandinavia or Holland. So the idea that you need to kill the king or kill the queen has completely declined as their power has done the same thing. Monarchies that still exist, and they are of course quite a minority now, either just take the back seat governmentally or kick back only very, very occasionally. So in that very limited sense, perhaps, I suppose the left has finally won through regicide. But it's usually the right who benefit from regicide in this brief study that I've looked at here. Now, you could look at the three of the four pictures on this screen. The top left, by the way, is Gustav of Sweden. And you could say, well, hang on a minute. You say that the right have won, but the world's first communist state was formed in Russia, and that was partly down to the execution of Nicholas. You could certainly, date sort of populism and radical uprisings from below and the left with the French Revolution and all the rest of it. And as for, if you get rid of a king and replace with parliament, you've got to be moving to the left. And yeah, okay, I get that. I understand that. But the Soviet regime that killed Nicholas Romanov was government in the name of the people, but it wasn't really very different from the oppressive rule of the czars that had gone before. And this is the moment for my Bakunin quote about, when the people are being beaten with a stick, they're not much happier if it is called the people's stick. And that's pretty profound in this instance. The execution of Louis Capet didn't usher in a period of left-wing government. It actually ushered in a period of confused and frankly illiberal blundering until a new monarch came in, that's Napoleon, and took control. So yes, okay, nominally Russia and France moved to the left, but in practice they didn't. They remained essentially with right features, or right-wing features, just a different name for it. And for every act carried out by Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector, which suggests, there's a more tolerant, popular left-wing approach going on here. So, for instance, the legalization of immigration from Jewish communities into England, there's one that smacks of kingship or monarchy, like the the arbitrary massacre at Drogheda. Not least, of course, the fact that when Cromwell dies, the first person they offer the leadership of England to is his son, which, if that doesn't suggest kingship to you, you probably need to check up on what kingship means. So, in summary, I suppose, regicide, even by a very loose definition, which I've employed here, is clearly not a practical tool for regime change. What it actually is, quite curiously, is an historically schizophrenic action. It can be employed either as a way of preserving the past by closing down new developments, that is to say, by killing the monarch who is attempting to modernize, or it is a way of preventing the past from ever being resurrected by killing the monarch in order to prevent any kind of return to their rule. So in the first instance, you see the killing of Gustav of Sweden, and in the second instance, you see the execution of Nicholas Romanov. Okay, this is going to go out as a YouTube premiere, so if anyone's listening to this or watching it, then I'll be very happy to take your questions, but otherwise, that's that. I hope you all have a good half term if I don't speak to you beforehand, and yeah, enjoy the sun, but wash your hands again. Oh, and keep bees. Bye.